In this session, I'm going to be discussing the book of Exodus. And this is probably one of the most well-known and most important books in the Old Testament. It's a central formational event for ancient Israel. I'm going to talk about what that means, but this story, the Exodus tradition, is the most central tradition in the Old Testament. There are references to it in pretty much every section of the Old Testament. Many of the prophets will refer back to it in some way. Many of the Psalms will discuss it. So there's no single event that is more important than this. And so it really stands at the center of everything in the Old Testament. Now, as with Genesis, again, we're covering a lot of material here, and most of it narrative, most of it is story. So I'm going to presume that you have done the reading, in particular Exodus 1 through 15, which is the story of the Exodus, because I'm not going to go through all of that, but you will be responsible for making sure you know the basic details of that story. So make sure you have read that you have also done the reading. And Longman, he will discuss some of the main themes there as well. And I will hit some of them, but I'm not going to cover every detail in this. What I want to first begin with is to discuss the nature of the Exodus story. The Exodus story is, or the Exodus as an event, actually, is what we would call a formative event. A formative event is the event or the story, the circumstances for which a group of people trace their origins back to, or some key part of their identity is formed in that event. So, for example, for the United States, examples of formative events would be the Revolutionary War, obviously, but also the landing of the Mayflower Pilgrims at Plymouth. That's a foundational event. And the important thing to know about a foundational event is that although it's the foundational narrative of group origins, it doesn't necessarily need to be the experience of the entire group or the ancestors of the entire group. That's important to note because most Americans are not directly descended from the Mayflower Pilgrims, and yet that is still a foundational, formative event for America. So that's going to be important to keep in mind as we discuss the book of Exodus. Now, it's really in the book of Exodus that archaeology and ancient history outside the Bible begin to become very important. These are, this is when we start to see discussion of major events, that could be correlated with archaeology. So national scale events. In the book of Genesis, there's very little that could be corroborated by archaeology. Archaeology is not good at identifying individual people. So for archaeology to have much to say about whether there was a guy named Abraham who did these things is very difficult. You can't really do that. What it can do is maybe confirm that it accurately reflects lifestyle conditions at that time. But with the Exodus, we start to enter into these large-scale national events that in theory should be able to be confirmed with archaeology. And so archaeology becomes very important in this book and moving forward because we're dealing with national level events. Recent archaeology, the Exodus has been one of those major litmus tests with, well, does archaeology confirm the Bible? Does it support the Bible? Does it show that the Bible is historically inaccurate? Exodus has been at the very center of that. And throughout the course of the 20th century, and now moving into the 21st century, the pendulum has swung back and forth on whether or not archaeology supports the historicity of this event. So I want to discuss some of those issues here. Recent archaeology, and really I'm talking about from about 1980, from the late 70s onward, recent archaeology has tended to say that Israelite origins essentially are Canaanite. That when you look at the material culture, and archaeology really is concerned with material culture, with things like pottery, the style of houses that are built, that the material culture, the remains of ancient Israel, are virtually indistinguishable from those of the Canaanites. In other words, they lived in houses that looked like, were very similar to Canaanite houses. They used pottery that essentially was the same as what the Canaanites were using. Their language, so we look at inscriptions, or we look at just the text that we have, the Canaanite languages are very, very similar to Hebrew. The writing system, the alphabet that the Israelites were using, the Hebrew alphabet, was essentially borrowed from Canaanites, particularly from the Phoenicians. So their language is the same. We don't have Israelite texts written in Egyptian. We have them written in what really seems to be a Canaanite dialect. Their religion, believe it or not, is actually very similar to Canaanite religion in many ways, not only in terms of material culture, so the way the temple or the tabernacle is built, it is very, very similar to the structure of Canaanite temples, the types of architecture that we find, the altars. You read in Exodus and Leviticus about four-horned altars. Well, we find four-horned altars at Canaanite worship sites as well. Even the artwork, things like cherubim, are not unique to the Bible. Cherubim are winged sphinxes, and they are found oftentimes in Canaanite temples, either at the entrances or on the walls, or oftentimes on thrones. Kings would have cherub thrones. We'll see that later on in some of the prophets. Ezekiel in particular will have Yahweh, will have the Israelite God riding on a chariot throne that is surrounded by cherubim. Even the name that they're using for God in many cases, there are two names that are used for God in the Old Testament. One is Yahweh, and Yahweh is the distinctly Israelite name. It is only used to describe the God of Israel. The other is Elohim, or sometimes the shortened form El. And it is not really a name, it's a title. It just means God. And it's common to both Israelites and Canaanites. The head god, the chief god of the Canaanites, was named El. And so that's a point of similarity with the Old Testament. In fact, if you even look at the name of the country, Israel, it's using the name El, or Elohim, not Yahweh. So that may tell us something about what name they were using to worship their God. And this is actually addressed in the book of Exodus in chapter 6. Yahweh, the God of Israel, addresses this. It says to Moses, "In previous times I revealed myself to your ancestors as El," or El Shaddai is another form of that name. "I did not tell them my real name, which is Yahweh, but now I am revealing that to you, and that's the name I want you to use for me in the future. You call me by my real name, Yahweh." But it's acknowledging that the Israelite ancestors did not worship a God named Yahweh. They worshiped a God named El, or Elohim. And what Exodus 6 is doing is identifying Yahweh with Elohim, saying they are the same God with two different names. Right. But that is a point of similarity with Canaanite culture. Adding to this is the absence of any direct evidence for the Exodus itself. There is no direct archaeological or textual evidence to confirm the Exodus. There have been some people who have claimed it, some people who have claimed that they found chariot wheels at the bottom of the Red Sea, or that there's an Egyptian text that mentions the Exodus. None of that is true. It is all sort of fantastical, sensationalist stuff, but no scientific archaeological excavations, no official excavations have found any of this evidence, and it's not clearly mentioned in any non-Israelite texts from ancient times, not until you get to many, many centuries after the event, in say the first century or so. So what do we do with that? There's no outside corroborating evidence for this event. Do we need that? Does that mean it did not occur? Well, there are a few things to keep in mind. So, on the one hand, we don't have any archaeological evidence, and the archaeological evidence that we do have tends to say that the Israelites seem to be very, very Canaanite. They don't seem like a group that originated somewhere else and moved into the land. On the other hand, the Exodus story is very deeply ingrained in biblical tradition. It is present in all levels: early texts, late texts, prophets, poetry, liturgy, legal texts, narrative. Is extremely central, and it's hard to imagine that an event that just didn't occur at all, that was just made up whole cloth, would become such a central event, central part of Israelite tradition. It seems like there has to be at least some sort of a historical kernel there to build this around. Imagine that someone came up with a complete fabrication for American origins. They said, "Oh well, America really emerged from, let's say, Chinese immigrants who crossed over the Pacific Ocean somehow and came in that direction." That would be very difficult to pull off that fabrication, because we have records, right? It's sort of our collective consciousness. We know, through tradition where we came from. So likewise, it would be very difficult for, as early as we find this, we find references to the Exodus in texts that scholars date as far back as about 1100 BC, which is perhaps only about 100 years after the Exodus itself, depending on when you date that. That's not a lot of time. There would have been, the children or grandchildren of people who experienced the event still alive, and they would know if they were making things up. So that's a problem, for saying that it didn't occur. The later events, like the exile and the return from exile, are compared with the Exodus. And so in order for those comparisons to work, there has to be something there to build upon. Otherwise, the comparison doesn't mean anything, doesn't make any sense. One of the earliest texts, possibly the oldest text in the Old Testament, is Exodus 15, which is a celebration, a liturgy, celebrating the crossing of the sea after the Exodus. And that seems to be the earliest text. Now, one thing you need to bear in mind is that in the Old Testament, when we talk about the dating of texts, is not the same as when the events that they are describing occur. For example, Genesis 1 describes creation, but it is not the oldest text. You can have a much later text that is written to describe early events. And that seems to be the case. Genesis 1 actually seems to be a fairly late text, probably written in the exile, or maybe even a little bit after it. So that's the 6th century. Nor can you assume that the order in which books occur in the Old Testament necessarily tells you when they were written. They are not in chronological order as far as their writing goes. Now, they are in roughly chronological order relating to events, although not strictly speaking, but close to it. But that doesn't mean that the books were actually written in that order. And so even within a single book, many times we're dealing with books that were written over a long period of time or that incorporate early sources. And Exodus 15, based on vocabulary, based on the style of language, based on the genre of the text, is, by many scholars, is dated to be one of the earliest texts, written around 1100 or so. So very, very close to the event. Also, there is some circumstantial evidence. We do know that there were Semitic slaves, Semitic referring to the ethnicity, the broad people group that the Israelites belonged to. We do know that there were Semitic slaves in Egypt at this time in the late Bronze Age. We have texts that mention that. We have artwork that shows them there. And sure enough, from time to time, groups of slaves escaped, and they would go out into the desert and escape. So it's not unheard of that something like this could happen. And probably the last piece of evidence, and maybe the strongest, aside from maybe the centrality of the event, is the nature of this story. It is an ignominious story. It is not something that a group of people would be likely to make up as where they come from. What group of people would invent a story that says we started out as slaves? Usually, myths of origin have nations being, very prestigious. They are, children of the gods, or they are chosen somehow by the gods. You don't often find that a nation would say that their origins were that they were slaves. So it's not if you were going to make up a story of origins, this doesn't seem like the story that you would make up. So what do we do with these two lines of conflicting evidence? A lack of archaeological evidence, or even evidence that seems to be problematic for the Exodus tradition, with the textual evidence, the internal textual evidence that strongly supports it. One solution to this is to see Israel as a mixed multitude. This is to say that there was an Exodus group, that something happened, that there was a group of slaves who escaped from Egypt and had this story of deliverance from slavery that became this, the foundation of the Exodus narrative. But perhaps it was not the entire nation. Perhaps it was just a small portion of their ancestors, a smaller group of runaway slaves. This is a very common view among many scholars today, to say, well, there has to be some historical basis for this story, but it doesn't necessarily need to be the experience of all of the ancestors of the Israelites. You have a small group that their story becomes adopted as the national epic. And you could compare this with, for the example I used earlier, of the Mayflower Pilgrims. Again, the vast majority, overwhelming majority of Americans have no ancestral connection with the Mayflower Pilgrims. And yet we have this ritual observance every year, Thanksgiving. And I'll bet you don't have an ancestor that was on the Mayflower, but I'll bet you still eat the turkey, and you still think of that first Thanksgiving and the Mayflower and the Pilgrims as a part of your history, because it's national history, not individual history. So you could think of it very similarly, that maybe the majority of later Israelites really did have origins from Canaanite culture. And in fact, there's a lot of evidence for that. If you pay attention later on, there seem to be an awful lot of foreigners living among the Israelites. David's got a guy named Uriah the Hittite, who is one of his top commanders in his army. You've got figures like Ruth, who's a Moabite, who comes into the nation, and she is the great-grandmother of King David. It seems like, especially early on, Israel really is a mixed group that includes foreigners who have joined themselves to Israel. And so that's may support the idea of a mixed multitude. Also, the fact that we've got a ritual here around it. Again, if you think about the parallel with Thanksgiving, rituals very easily can take a small group's experience and make it into a foundational story for the entire larger group. And in fact, we have that with the Exodus, because Exodus is also connected with a ritual, with the Passover meal. So they enact that year after year. And in fact, part of the Passover liturgy that is used says each generation of Israelites should eat this meal as though they had personally been slaves in Egypt, even though they haven't been, but you're supposed to identify with the story. So this is a very easy mechanism for people to adopt this as their own story. So there's some Some things to consider there. Another issue to consider is, when does this event occur? Again, assuming it did occur, and I believe it did occur, but there's also disagreement about when. There are two likely dates. The first is based on another biblical text. In 1 Kings 6, verse 1, the construction of Solomon's temple is dated in relation to the Exodus. It says it's 480 years after the Exodus. And we know roughly when Solomon's temple was dedicated. So we can calculate back 480 years from that, from the year 965 was the dedication of the temple. And so you calculate back and you end up with a date around 1445 BC as the date of the Exodus. So the internals, that's when the Bible itself dates it. On the other hand, there are problems with archaeological evidence. We'll see this more when we get into the book of Joshua and we talk about the conquest. But the problem is that there's not a lot of evidence for widespread destruction of cities in Canaan in the 15th century, which is when that would need to occur, around 1400. We don't find evidence of cities being destroyed, at least not the cities that need to be destroyed around that time. Also, at that time, Egypt still controls Canaan. In fact, the peak of the Egyptian Empire was in the 13th century during the reign of Ramses II. And at that time, they controlled everything from Syria all the way down into Egypt, was part of the Egyptian Empire. So if the Israelites escaped in the 15th century and went into the land of Canaan, they would not have actually been escaping from Egypt. That was still Egyptian territory. The Egyptians would have been there waiting for them. And yet, we don't find in the Bible they don't have any problems with the Egyptians after the Exodus. After they cross the Red Sea, the Egyptians are out of the picture. They are not among the enemies that the Israelites fight. There's also the problem of historical evidence, that there are texts that begin to mention the Israelites, but they date much later than this. They date from the 13th century, is the first time that Israel is mentioned in any other texts. So all of that has led many scholars to posit another date. That we find evidence of Israel emerging in Canaan around the year 1200. So the late date, many scholars have proposed, is around 1250 or so, because it's around 1200 that they start to see evidence of a new group of people. Numerous villages begin to be built in the Central Hills, in the area that later is Israel. All these new villages pop up. There's a population boom. A lot more people suddenly living there around 1200. Where are they coming from? There's not enough people there beforehand to account for them. And also there is some internal biblical evidence to support this. Exodus chapter 1 mentions that there were two cities that the Israelites built for the Egyptians. Verse 11 says they built the cities of Pithom and Ramses. And these sites have been identified in the Nile Delta region and were built around the year in the 13th century, in the 1200s. And in fact, that signals a shift. There was a new dynasty that took power at that time, and they shifted the capital from further down the Nile up into the Delta region. And so that circumstantial evidence would support a later date. If they're building these cities, and in fact one of them, Ramses, is named after a 13th century king, Ramses II, that would point toward a later date in the 1200s. So nowadays, among those scholars who do see a historical basis for the Exodus, the late date is the favored date, around 1250 BC. It better conforms to the archaeological evidence that we have, again, with the destruction of cities, with the building of these cities in Egypt. It correlates with the evidence of the emergence of a new people group. We'll talk about that more when we get to Joshua. And there is some evidence of invasion and destruction. There are some cities like Hatzor that are destroyed around the year 1200 that could be correlated with the arrival of the Israelites. On the other hand, we need to bear in mind if indeed the Exodus was only a small group, if it wasn't a huge group of people but a small group of Israelite ancestors, how much evidence would they have left behind? Would we have evidence of a huge group of people walking around? Would it have left much of an impression in Israelite or in Egyptian texts? A small group of runaway slaves could have lived as nomads out in the desert for centuries before they would be mentioned in any other texts or before there would be much archaeological evidence for them. So in the end of the day, I think we've got kind of a big question mark here. Sometime between the 15th century and the 13th century is when Israel emerges and when this event would have occurred. I still would lean probably toward the later date, but the early date is maybe possible if we understand that to be a small group of people who are living out in the desert and thus not encountering the Egyptians until much later. But that would also have problems. It would stretch out the period that they're in the wilderness much longer than the 40 years that is mentioned in the book of Numbers. So it's a trade-off. Something else for us to consider now after having looked at issues of history and archaeology is the story of the Exodus itself. The book of Exodus consists of two parts. The first part is the Exodus story itself, which is primarily chapters 1 through 15, but we could actually extend that up through 18, is describing the escape from Egypt, the plagues, and the journey to Mount Sinai. And then it stops, and chapters 19 all the way through the end of Exodus, and then actually continuing all the way through Leviticus and a good chunk of Numbers, all take place at Mount Sinai. They stay there for about a year and receive the law and build a place of worship called the tabernacle. But we're primarily going to focus on the first part, on the story of the Exodus, and we'll put the other stuff, the law, off to week 2 to look at priestly theology. The story of the Exodus it presupposes again the Joseph story. So I mentioned in the previous video that the Joseph story at the end of Genesis explains how the Israelites come to be in Egypt. And that picks up then in Exodus with the growth of the nation from the 70 people who come down into Egypt with Joseph. So his brothers and their families and Jacob come down there and settle in the land of Egypt, and they stay there. They get comfortable there. They're fruitful and they multiply. The problem is that there's a dynasty change. Now, there is maybe some historical background to this. We do know from Egyptian sources that in the 17th, 16th century, there was a group of people called the Hyksos. They were non-Egyptian. They were Semitic peoples, actually related to the Israelites, who seized power in Egypt. And they temporarily, for about 150 years, they overthrew native Egyptian rule and they established their own kingdom in Egypt. And so we call it the Hyksos kingdom. Around the year 1550, a new Egyptian dynasty emerges. This is the beginning of the new kingdom. And the Hyksos are driven out of Egypt. And so there's a dynasty change and a restoration of native Egyptian rule. It may very well be that that correlates with the change in dynasty that is referred to in the book of Exodus, where it says that a new king who did not know Joseph arose. It may not be just an individual king. It may mean a new dynasty. And a dynasty that is much less favorable toward the Israelites. And remember, the Hyksos would have been sort of distant cousins. They were Semitic. They would have The Egyptians probably would have identified these people with one another as kin. And so, in the wake of the overthrow of the Hyksos, may have been very, very defensive against groups of foreigners, and particularly of Semitic peoples living in the land of Egypt. You could actually correlate this very, very much with contemporary events, with the issues of immigration in America today, and with the recent election, and do we build a wall? Do we deport people? Much that same sort of fear and tension with foreigners living in the land. And so it leads to the oppression and the enslavement of the Israelites. And so in order to control them, they are enslaved, and the Egyptians set over them taskmasters to make their lives difficult. They also begin trying to control the population. So they look at the Israelites and they say, there's a lot of these people. And there are so many of them that they might unite together and join with our enemies and overthrow us, just like what happened with the Hyksos. So they implement means of population control. They begin to kill the boys. They give orders for the boys to be killed. First, they instruct the midwives when a child is born, if it's a boy, they're supposed to kill them. The midwives don't obey. They fear God, it says, and they did not carry out the order. So the next step is the Egyptians send soldiers around to find young boys, infant boys of the Israelites, and to kill them. Enter Moses. Moses will be the central figure in this story. Moses is born to a family of Levites, one of the tribes of Israel. And when he is born under this order, he's kept in secret. His parents hide him away for a few months to keep him from being killed. When he is old enough that he's hard to keep hidden, his parents have a difficult choice to make. His mother decides that it would be better for him to have a shot at living away from her than to stay and to be killed. So she constructs a basket and seals it and puts it in the Nile River and puts Moses in it and sends it floating down the river. It is discovered by none other than the Pharaoh's daughter, who is out bathing in the Nile. She finds this basket with a baby in it, and she adopts him as her own. Now, she knows that he's an Israelite and adopts him anyway, so there's an exception to the rule. But he is actually going to be raised by his mother because she needs a wet nurse to nurse the baby. Moses' sister, Miriam, had been following along, and she comes up to the Pharaoh's son and says, "Oh, hey, I know an Israelite nurse that can nurse the child." So he's raised the first few years of his life by his actual mother before he then returns to the Pharaoh's palace and grows up there. And contrary to what you see in all the movies, he knows that he is an Israelite. There's no reason to think he didn't. And he also was nowhere near being heir to the throne. The Egyptians would never have let that happen, not after the Hyksos. They would not have allowed, under any circumstances, for a foreigner to come to the throne. So he is an Israelite, but he grows up in the Egyptian court. Interestingly, this story is very, very similar to a story that we have from ancient Babylon. There was a Babylonian king, in fact, the founder of the first dynasty over there, called the Akkadian Kingdom, a guy named Sargon, who has a story that's very, very similar to this, where he is born in secret. His mother is a priestess, and she hides him away because the priestesses were not supposed to have children. They were like nuns. They were supposed to be celibate. And she, likewise, to save him, puts him in a basket and sends it down the river, to the Euphrates River. And he's discovered not by a princess, but by a man out there drawing water out of the river, and is raised in secret, and then he eventually becomes a king. So a very, very similar story here. Also, this event of him being drawn out of the Nile is significant for his name. Now, the biblical text says that the Pharaoh's daughter names him Moses because she drew him out of the water. Now, in Egyptian or in Hebrew, the verb mashah means to draw out, and this is the etymology for his name. His name is Moshe in Hebrew, which means drawing out of the water. But it's weird. Why would an Egyptian princess even know Hebrew? And why would she give a child a Hebrew name? That seems odd. And in fact, the name Moses could also be traced back to an Egyptian etymology. The Egyptian word masas means begotten by, son of. And it's very, very common in Egyptian names for them to end with masas, meaning son of or begotten of. For example, there's a king named Tutmosis, means son of Tot, or Ramses, son of Ra. So it may very well be that she actually wants his name to be an Egyptian name, and perhaps it had originally included the name of an Egyptian god, and that has been chopped off by the biblical writers because, hey, you don't want Moses, you don't want your founder to have the name of a pagan god. And so they're giving it an alternate etymology. But it could be an Egyptian name or a Hebrew name. Well, what we learn about Moses is that he grows up again in Pharaoh's court, but he knows he's an Israelite, and as an adult, he actually tries to deliver the Israelites. See, there's a story about how he sees an Egyptian one day beating an Israelite slave, and he kills the Egyptian and buries his body in the sand. Maybe his plan is to liberate the Israelites one dead taskmaster at a time. Well, it comes out. Later he sees two Israelites fighting and he tries to break them up, and they say, oh, are you going to kill us like you did the Egyptian? So he knows that his secret has been discovered. And in fact, Pharaoh finds out about it and wants to kill Moses. So Moses flees the country. He flees to the land of Midian, where he adopts the life of a shepherd. He marries a local girl, the daughter of a priest named Reuel, or Jethro. He goes by two different names, and settles out to be a shepherd. And so he's living a quiet life until one day he is out in the wilderness tending the sheep, and he sees a strange sight. He sees a bush that is burning but not being consumed. There's fire, but the bush is not, for some reason, actually burning. So he goes over to see this, and a voice comes out of the bush and says, first of all, it says, take off your shoes, the land you're standing on is holy ground. It reveals himself as the God of Moses' ancestors. I am the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob. And this voice coming out of the bush commissions Moses to go back to Egypt and deliver the Israelites from slavery. Now Moses protests. He says, I am not a good speaker. I don't know how to speak. And so the voice, God says, oh, that's okay. I'm going to send your brother Aaron. He'll speak for you. So, and then Moses says, well, the people won't believe me. They'll ask what God has sent me. I don't even know your name. Again, as mentioned earlier, that the name of the Israelite God is not revealed yet. And so they may be going by this generic Elohim. But he's going to say, well, what is your name? And so God says, I am that I am. You shall tell them that I am has sent you. And this word, this name I am, is related to the name Yahweh. In Hebrew, it would be Eyeh Asher Eyeh. And what they share is the verb, the verbal root that is used here, Hayah. It means to be or to exist. And most likely, the name Yahweh is based on that root. It probably means something like he causes to exist, the one who causes things to exist. In other words, the creator God. But he's playing with that word here. Say, tell them, Eyeh Asher Eyeh. I am who I am, or I am that I am. So Moses returns to Egypt, albeit reluctantly. God gives him miraculous signs to perform. He tells him, take your staff, throw it on the ground, it will turn into a snake or into a serpent. And He tells him, you pour water out, you can turn it into blood, you can afflict yourself with leprosy and then cleanse it. So he gives him these miraculous signs to perform. He goes back to Egypt to perform them. So he arrives in Egypt, goes before the Pharaoh, does the snake trick and turns his staff into a snake. Now, interestingly, in the actual Hebrew text, it uses a different word there. The word for snake is nachash, and that is the word that is used in Exodus 3. But later on, when he's actually before Pharaoh in Exodus 9, it doesn't use the word nachash. It's not a snake. It uses the word tanin. Tanin is a word for a sea monster or a dragon in Hebrew. And in fact, in the Greek translation, the Septuagint, the Greek translation of the Old Testament, it uses the word drakon there, which is where our word dragon comes from. So I'm not sure why English translators always want to translate this as serpent or snake, because the Hebrew text and the Greek text both support translating it as a dragon. Maybe they do that because, hey, dragons don't exist. Well, staffs also don't turn into things. So you're dealing with a miraculous story. It very well could be a dragon. In fact, I like that because in ancient Near Eastern mythology, dragons are symbols of chaos, the powers of evil. And by controlling that, by turning his staff into a dragon and then being able to pick up that dragon by the tail and turn it back into a serpent, it symbolizes Moses as the master of chaos. Elsewhere in the Old Testament, Pharaoh, the Egyptian king, is sometimes described as a tanin, as a sea monster. And I like the imagery there that it represents Pharaoh, and that Moses is the master of Pharaoh. So I like that. I like that reading better. But throughout this story, we find that the Pharaoh will not let the people go. It is only through a series of plagues, there are 10 of these, that Moses performs that force the Egyptians to let the Israelites go. So these include a number of things. They include turning the Nile into blood. They include frogs, a plague of frogs and flies and boils and hail and darkness, all of these plagues that afflict them. And throughout all of these, we read over and over again that it says that Pharaoh's heart was hardened. And here I want to call your attention to something in Exodus 7. This is when God first commissions Moses. He says that you shall speak, these things to Pharaoh. But he says, I will harden Pharaoh's heart, and I will multiply my signs and wonders in the land of Egypt. I will harden Pharaoh's heart. God hardens Pharaoh's heart so that he will not let the people go. Now, why would he do that? This is something I really want you to consider, especially for the first paper that's due in this class, where you're to consider either Exodus or Joshua and think about the way God is portrayed as a divine warrior, as someone who uses violence against Israel's enemies. And here, the added dimension to that is that it seems like God actually causes Pharaoh not to let the Israelites go, so that, he says, and I will multiply my signs and wonders in the land of Egypt. God causes Pharaoh not to let them go so that he can afflict Egypt with plagues. Why would he do that? It seems Pharaoh is not given a free choice here. God hardens his heart. Why would God do that? Now, it's something for you to consider, but something else I think to consider here is what he follows that up with. He says, when Pharaoh does not listen to you, I will lay my hands upon Egypt and bring my people, the Israelites, company by company, out of the land of Egypt by great acts of judgment. The Egyptians shall know that I am the Lord when I stretch out my hand against Egypt and bring the Israelites out from among them. So one result of these plagues, which result from Pharaoh's heart being hardened, is that the Egyptians also know who God is, that it reveals God to them. So that's something else to consider. That what is there a reason why God needs these plagues to occur? We'll find out later on that when the Israelites do arrive in the land of Canaan, the Canaanites have heard of them. They already know about them because they've heard about all the things that happened in Egypt and how the Israelite God afflicted the Egyptians. So it gives them a reputation. It causes the people to fear them. So there may be reasons why God would do this, but it's God who hardens Pharaoh's heart. And so it drags this whole process out for 10 plagues. The last of the plagues is that the firstborn children of the Israelites, or of the Egyptians, are all killed. So the death of the firstborn is the last plague. And this is the origins of the Passover ritual, Passover being one of the Israelite festivals later on. It emerges from this because what the Israelites are instructed to, on the night when the firstborn are going to die, they're to slaughter a lamb and take its blood and spread that blood on the doorposts of their house, so that when the destroyer, seemingly an angel, something that comes through the land of Egypt to kill the firstborn, sees the blood on the doorpost, it will pass over that house. Presumably, it's like, when you, during times of disaster, when the search teams go through, they'll make, an X, a red X on the door to signal that, hey, we've already checked out this house. It seems like that. So he sees the blood, he thinks, oh, I've already been here. Someone already died here. There's blood, right? So he passes over that house. This then becomes a ritual meal. Every year, the Israelites are to eat this meal, including a lamb that's been slaughtered, and also some other items, some unleavened bread, or what's called matzah. And the idea behind that is that they are driven out of Egypt so quickly that they don't have time to let their bread rise. They eat it with bitter herbs to symbolize the bitterness of slavery. And so this becomes a ritual meal. It's very important later on in the New Testament. Jesus actually dies on Passover. So there's all kinds of symbolism there. We'll talk about that more in a little bit. But that's how they are delivered from Egypt, is through the death of the firstborn. So they leave Egypt, and after a little bit, maybe a day or two, Pharaoh's heart is hardened again. So here we go again. The Israelites have left, but suddenly Pharaoh is like, nah, I'm not going to let them go. So he chases them out in the wilderness. And they arrive at they are camped out on the edge of a sea. Now, traditionally, this is called the Red Sea. And the Red Sea is a large body of water that separates Africa from the Arabian Peninsula. However, that is not actually what the Hebrew text says. It is not the word for red. It's not, the Red Sea in Hebrew would be the Yam Adom. It is not called that. It is called the Yam Suf. Suf in Hebrew means reed, as in like the cattails, the plants that grow along the edge of water. So it's the Reed Sea, not the Red Sea. Now, you could argue that maybe that's just another name for the same body of water. If so, it's odd because there are no reeds growing along the Red Sea. It's a saltwater body. And reeds grow along freshwater lakes and rivers. So it would be an odd name for it. So what many scholars have proposed is that perhaps this sea was not the Red Sea, but was a freshwater lake. And we have believe that there used to be a series of freshwater lakes running from the Mediterranean Sea down to the Gulf of Aqaba, or the Gulf of Suez, rather, the Gulf of Suez, across the Sinai Peninsula, separating Egypt from the Sinai Peninsula. And it may be one of these lakes that they are camped out on. And I don't say that to minimize the story. Some people have suggested, well, if it was a shallow freshwater lake, then what happens here is the miracle at the sea God splits the sea. The wind drives back the waters, and so the Israelites cross through on dry land as the waters are parted. And so they're saved at the sea. And some have argued, well, maybe it was a shallow, maybe it was like knee-deep water, and a good strong wind could have driven the water back. The problem is what happens after they cross the sea. And that is that the Egyptians they go into the dry land as well, and the waters come crashing back on them and drown them, which is hard to imagine with knee-deep water. However, whatever body of water this is, in order for the story to work, it has to be enough water to drown an army. So it has to be a significant body of water. And again, this is what is celebrated in Exodus 15, this poem called the Song of the Sea. The oldest text in the Old Testament is a celebration of this event. So if anything has claim to historicity and antiquity, it would be this event. They're celebrating this very early on. It's an important part of the story. So you can't leave out the victory at the sea. This is earliest Israelite tradition. So that's the story of the Exodus. Now what follows that is they arrive at the mountain. They arrive at Mount Sinai, and the law is revealed to them, the Ten Commandments, and so forth. We will discuss that more in the next module when we get into priestly law. But they will, from Exodus 19 onward, they are at the mountain. We will discuss that next week. What I'd like to consider lastly here is the legacy of the Exodus. Again, this is a very important story in the Old Testament, and it's had an important impact on culture since then. This story has been a story of it's a story of the liberation of oppressed peoples, and many oppressed peoples throughout history have identified with this story. Not only Jews, but certainly you have the Jews in the Babylonian exile later on. We'll talk about that later on. And then in diaspora, as they live out in the Gentile world and were at times persecuted and their lives were threatened. And most recently, of course, you could think in the 20th century with the Holocaust, that the story of the Exodus is an encouragement to Jews whose lives are threatened, who are oppressed in foreign lands. They could go back to the story and say, well, God saved us once, perhaps God will save us again. Other groups of people have used it as well. Believe it or not, in the American Revolution, the colonists identified themselves with the Israelites to say that we are like the Israelites. And just as God saved and supported the Israelite slaves against a foreign tyrant, against the Pharaoh, so also God is with us, and God will save us from King George. So they adopted that story as their own. More poignantly even, African Americans. The African American slaves identified themselves very easily with the Israelite slaves. That they could look to the God of the Exodus as a God who fights for and defends oppressed people. He is the God of slaves, and he frees the slaves from their slavery. So many of the old African spirituals invoke the Exodus as a foundational narrative, supporting the idea of liberation from slavery. And that's picked up then again in the 20th century, in the 60s and 70s, in the civil rights movement. Figures like Martin Luther King Jr. If you've never read any of his writings or listened to any of his speeches, pay attention to them. He uses Exodus imagery, Exodus language. His very last sermon that he preached was entitled, "I Have Been to the Mountain," which recalls the story of Moses. We'll maybe touch on that a little bit more later on in Deuteronomy, because he's invoking Deuteronomy there in particular. But he is in many ways a Moses-like figure. And even theologically today, there is a movement called liberation theology. This is particularly among Latin American Christians who see the implications of the Exodus story and other biblical texts as God is a liberating God, not only liberation from sin, but liberation from actual enslavement and from economic oppression, from poverty. And so they look at this as a story that supports Christianity as a liberating force. It also has tremendous theological importance for Christianity in terms of salvation. The theological importance, the legacy of the Exodus, is one for Judaism, is the importance of God's saving acts, and that this event is the basis of the Sinai covenant. So all of the laws that follow from Exodus 19 onward are predicated upon the event of the Exodus. And this is especially true when we get into Deuteronomy. It's always going to be going back to the Exodus and saying, because of this, because God freed us from slavery, here's why we should obey these laws. Many of the laws themselves are based upon principles coming out of the Exodus, of God as a God of the oppressed. And then for Christians, again, I mentioned that Jesus dies at Passover, and so it invites the correlation between Jesus and the Passover lamb, that just as the Passover lamb is slaughtered and its blood is applied to the doorpost to save the inhabitants, to save the firstborn, so also Jesus. The blood of Jesus is very important in Christian theology. That Jesus is, in a sense, a Passover lamb whose death substitutes for us. So you could view this as a typology of redemption through Christ. So that's the Exodus. So again, a very, very important book. We spent more time on this than probably we will most other books, but that is because it is very important. Genesis and Exodus are very foundational for the rest of the Old Testament. If you don't understand these books, it's very difficult to appreciate and to understand what comes next. So probably will not spend quite as much time lecturing on the other books in the Old Testament, but these two deserve a lot of attention.